First, Dr. Christopher McCabe, the CEO and Executive Director of the Institute of Health Economics. He trained and worked for 20 years in the UK before emigrating to Canada. During this time, he held full professorships at the universities of Sheffield, Warwick, and Leeds. He came to Canada as a professor of health economics at the University of Alberta and holds the Capital Health Endowed Research Chair focused on the evaluation, adoption, and implementation of precision medicine technologies. He has served on the Health Economics Working Group of the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technology in Healthcare and has authored the fourth edition of the CADITH Guidelines for the Economic Evaluation of Health Technologies in 2017. More recently, Dr. McCabe has advised the Patented Medicines Price Review Board on the technical issues related to the revision of the regulations for setting the price of new drugs in Canada. And he is currently the chair of the Royal Society of Canada's COVID Task Force Working Group on the Economy.
Thank you, Duncan, and thanks to the Gairdner Foundation for the invitation to speak today. I was listening to the end of the previous session and the discussion around how are we going to afford to implement these things, and so I've been asked to talk about equity and sustainability in Canadian access to gene therapy innovations. Let's hope this slide advance that works. Excellent. So I'm going to give a little bit of background so that people understand the challenges that we're facing. And then a discussion around what we mean by equity in access. It's an easy thing to say, and it's emotionally appealing that we should have this, but like many things, when you start unpacking it, it's not actually that simple. And then I'm going to talk to you about how we might be able to balance equity, innovation, and sustainability. And I'm going to present some work that we've been developing at the Institute of Health Economics, both with industry and government partners here in Canada. So, background, I'm sure you know this better than I. There's a number of cell and gene therapies, and an increasing number of gene therapies coming to market over the next 2 to 3 years. So this is a question we've discussed for a long time, on and off, but now it's a real question because we've got real decisions that are going to have to be made in the next 12 months about how we support or don't support the adoption of gene therapies here in Canada. And to make things more challenging, they're coming to the market in the time of COVID, where economically we have seen unprecedented loss in economic activity, reduction in GDP, and that's translated to substantial reductions in government revenues. So the money to pay for these things may well not be what they were, what we're used to. At the same time, in order to deal with the challenge of COVID, the federal government's been taking on what people would think of as really quite unprecedented amounts of debt borrowing. To give you a sense of how different the borrowing for COVID is, for the 2008 financial crisis, the federal government set aside about 39 billion. For COVID, the federal government has already committed 325 billion. So it's nearly an order of magnitude greater. We really haven't seen this scale of government expenditure and borrowing to support it since outside of times of war, frankly. And so the government finances are going to be challenging. We're very fortunate that we're also doing this at a time of unprecedentedly low interest rates. So as you can see on the dark black line, whilst the debt is forecast to increase very heavily through to COVID, the public debt charges are actually staying around the same level and arguably going to reduce. And it's not just federal government. Provincial governments are taking on debt as well, and these levels of debt have not been seen since the 1990s and earlier, and they're really only sustainable because of the very low debt charges, interest rates that we're dealing with. And so, as I think the federal finance minister said recently, the aim is to lock these borrowings in at these low interest rates over a long period. And so we can afford these things, but there is no doubt that governments are going to look very, very carefully at calls for additional public expenditure that can't make a strong case that they will drive economic recovery and economic development as we move into the future and as the world economy changes from an oil and gas driven energy sector to a more low or even no carbon future. That's going to be a challenge for Canada. I'm sitting here in Alberta, and that's a very acute challenge here. And so our governments are going to be challenged to take on additional expenditure in health and healthcare, and that's added to what's already a challenging environment for gene therapies coming to market at the moment. Let's see. Trying to move a slide up. There we go. So let's talk about equity and access. And as I alluded to, this is an appealing thought, but instinctively we support the idea of equity and access. But I want to unpack it a little bit more to help people understand that it's actually quite challenging to agree what we mean by it. And then to establish how we would achieve it. So equity and access. At the top level, we can give a really simple definition: an equal ability to access clinically indicated Health Canada approved gene therapies. Okay, so that seems quite straightforward, and I don't think people would argue with that. But that's not operational. Is it irrespective of ability to pay? So is that everybody in Canada gets it for whom it's clinically indicated? Or are there going to be some degrees of copay? Will it be covered through, as many drugs are, through private insurance? Or is this definitely something that the public purse is going to cover? Irrespective of the magnitude of benefit. So, if anything, is it that anything that's licensed by Health Canada should be accessed? Well, that's not the approach we take with most drugs. Actually, licensing is no longer a sufficient condition to achieve access to a therapy. Access depends upon the magnitude of benefit and how that relates to cost. So, are we arguing that for some reason gene therapy should be separate from that, protected from that requirement? That as long as it gets enough, has enough evidence of some effect compared to placebo, that gets it its license, and that therefore should be funded. I think that's quite hard to justify as a position, because actually it's creating inequity, because it's saying people whose disease is treated by gene therapy should be treated preferentially in their call on healthcare funds compared to people whose diseases are not treated by a gene therapy. So we need to think about how magnitude of benefit plays in to deciding who can get which gene therapies. Irrespective of the place of residence in Canada, so we have here in Canada a very strong push, and certainly the federal government's interested in pushing to a national pharmacare program, because we do have huge variation in access to drugs between provinces and territories, reflecting the size of the population and the budgets, the healthcare budgets that those populations can create. Even taking account of federal health transfers, we don't have equity in access for other therapies on a geographical basis. And there is a particular issue for gene therapies because they require, as we'll talk a little bit about more later, because they require quite specialist human and physical capital to deliver. Actually, it's not feasible for them to be readily accessible in all parts of Canada, all cities, for example. There's just not going to be enough demand for them to be economically sustainable. So when we talk or think about geographic equality in access, what does that actually mean? Is it feasible? Is it irrespective of the degree of clinical need? So there's strong evidence, and it makes a lot of sense that we are willing to pay more for treatments that address severe unmet need, and thankfully most gene therapies are seeking to address severe unmet need. But there is great heterogeneity, certainly in some diseases, genetic diseases, in actually the burden of those diseases. And earlier, one of the earlier speakers mentioned Gaucher's disease, where it's sort of the poster child for heterogeneity in the phenotypic expression. You can have identical twins who one's symptomatic in their teens and the other doesn't get to be symptomatic until their 50s. These are very different degrees of clinical need, and yet they're both those twins have the same genetic disease. How do we play that? How does that relate to equity and access? What do we define people as being, used to define people as being of equal clinical need? Is it at the genetic level or is it at the phenotypic level? I don't know, but it's an important question because it will drive volume of utilization. And then, the elephant in the room, irrespective of the cost of the gene therapy, some of these gene therapies are running at the high $100,000s, approaching $1 million per person. Others are likely to be coming to the market in the between the $100,000 and $200,000 per patient. Do we treat them equally? Do we say the difference in cost doesn't matter? That's a challenge to do. And do we want equivalent wait times? So that relates to the irrespective of place of residence, the geographic equity in access to gene therapies. That's probably simply not feasible, frankly. But how do we deal with that? What is a reasonable amount of additional effort to make to ensure that somebody in the Northern Territories accesses gene therapies in broadly the same way and broadly the same reliability and timelines as somebody living here in Edmonton in Alberta? What's a reasonable approximation of equivalency in wait times? And then with equivalent burden on the household economy, certainly for children who need these treatments, in the absence of these treatments, the impact on the household economy, their parents' ability to work, the children's, their siblings' educational and social development, there's lots of evidence that all of these things are impacted. How do we bring that in? It's important consideration. How do we do it? And we're not really at the point where we know how to do it. We know it's an important question, but we don't know how to currently bring that into the story of assessing the value of how that plays into the idea of equity of access. And something that we see a lot in rare diseases is the advocates compare what's available in Canada to what's available in other countries. It's a constant international comparison and an argument that, if it's available anywhere, it should be available here. Well, other countries have different budgets. They have different states of their economy. They have different competing demands on their healthcare budgets. Are we going to say that the access to gene therapy in Canada should be as good as the best access in any of our international comparators? And how much are we willing to sacrifice to achieve that? I don't have an answer, but I know that's a question. Is it that all Canadians, there should be equity in access for all Canadians as far as we can? Or is it actually we want Canadian access to be equal to access in other countries? Very challenging financially if we want to go there, being frank. So who decides which restrictions apply, and how will we operationalize these restrictions? Because let's be clear, we aren't going to be able to ignore these. We won't be able to say we're not paying, or we're going to pay whatever it takes. Those are the two extremes, and they're not viable, either of them. And to help you see why they're not viable, I'm going to pull up this map from Kai-Hi, and you can see that this is average. So the per head healthcare expenditure for each of the provinces, and it's in the range of around 6,500 to slightly over 19,000. So if you spend $1 million on one person's gene therapy, in Ontario, that's the equivalent of about 143 other persons' total annual use of the healthcare system. So it's not trivial. There really is a massive impact on what can be spent on other people. At the lower end, where we currently spend, in Nunavut, it's over 19,000, but that's still $1 million is still 52 people's annual expenditure on healthcare. So it really is these therapies. Whilst there was only one or two of them, we could kind of ignore this, but there's a lot of them coming down the line. You know that better than I, and we cannot continue to say, well, they're individually a small budget impact, because you add them up and they are starting to be a very substantial budget impact. We expect, the argument is that 1 in 12 people have a rare disease, and we want to develop therapies or see therapies developed to treat them all if we can. But the reality is that at these costs, that will displace a lot of other people's healthcare. And we need damn good reasons to do that, because those people will still want their healthcare. And the people we treat with the gene therapy, hopefully we cure them, and they will then go on and continue to need typical amounts of healthcare. They will also want their $6,000 a year, need their $6,000 a year worth of healthcare access. So this is not a problem we can duck and pretend shouldn't apply. It's a real problem, and it varies massively by province. The bigger the population, all things being equal, the more likely you are to get have folks with these conditions that are targeted by gene therapies. So, but equally, the bigger your economy, and so the ability of different healthcare payers in Canada to soak up these prices, these costs within their budgets, is radically different. Ontario's got a much bigger budget than Alberta, which has a much bigger budget than the Northern Territories. So there is a real geographic inequality in ability to soak up the costs of these therapies. So we have a challenge on our hands. So who decides which restrictions are going to apply in order to get our hands around this challenge? So, frankly, whoever is paying the bill decides. And at these prices, it's not going to be individuals, and it largely is unlikely to be private insurance payers, to be honest, in Canada. Because the prices are so large, the costs are so large, and often because of the burden of caring for someone with a severe disease, is such the households don't often won't have access to the private insurance to pay for these things. So it's going to fall to the public payer if we're being realistic. And so the public payer is going to decide what restrictions apply. And they're going to do that based on their objectives, what they are trying to achieve with their policy around healthcare and other areas. So, efficiency will certainly be part of the story. They will be wanting, on one hand, to get as much health from spending their budget as they can. And but they'll also be interested in broad equality of outcomes. They'll be interested in innovation because they want to see successful economies generating future tax revenue. They'll be interested in population health, and sometimes they'll be interested in minimizing costs. In these difficult times economically, they will be very interested in minimizing costs. And sometimes they will want to repatriate services. So if we're currently sending patients south of the border to get these services, they may be more willing to pay for them to avoid them being delivered out of province or out of country. All of these considerations will play into how payers decide to deal with these things. But they'll also be interested in sustainability. Can they, if they pay for this technology, will that lock them in to pay for the next technology? If so, at what price can they do that? Can they commit to that equity, supporting equity in the long term? So, what are we looking at? Well, we're trying to balance all of these competing needs. And in order to do so, we've developed this approach, looking at technologies over their life cycle. And so it builds on HTA, the standard work that CADTH does, and their standard assessment methods, cost effectiveness analysis, for assessing the value of innovations. But it's a development that responds to the increasing volume of high cost and highly uncertain technologies that regulators are approving for market access. So conditional licensing is great for prompt patient access if payers can then afford to pay. If the payers can't pay for these technologies, there will be no evidence generation. And so the regulators have presented payers with a problem, but the payers' response to those problems could in fact become a problem for the regulators. Because if they don't get additional evidence because the technologies are not reimbursed, then the patients don't get access, the long-term evidence they're looking to develop isn't created, and the companies will go bust. So it's a lose-lose, lose-lose-lose for everyone if we don't sort this out, given what the regulators have decided to do. And gene therapies are front and centre in this. So we focus on the evidentiary uncertainty. That uncertainty combined with a large per person budget impact means that conventional HTA will almost always say no, because conventional HTA just says, given what we know now, is this likely to be cost effective at the price that's asked? And, we know pretty much because of the uncertainty and the large budget impact, these are not going to be cost effective under conventional approaches. And so we have developed a new approach, which takes account of the fact that uncertainty has a value. If you think about this as an investment, when you invest, you think about the riskiness of the investment, and that influences how much you're willing to pay, how much you're willing to put into that company for buying that share, etc. Well, that's a specific example of how uncertainty has a value. And when we do more research, we reduce uncertainty. So when we get more evidence from utilization, we reduce uncertainty, and that also has a value. The reduction in uncertainty has a value. And so we use that to set out the design of a sustainable reimbursement strategy, where the value of uncertainty at the beginning allows you to identify an initial market access price. So what we're really saying here is the investment by the company doesn't stop when they get Health Canada approval. It has to continue whilst sufficient evidence is generated. And it continues by them accepting a lower price that reflects their share of the uncertainty in the evidence base. That conventionally, health systems have taken all of the residual uncertainty once a technology gets approval. But now, instead, you can identify a discount price that reflects the uncertainty for initial market access. And then you can generate real-world evidence that leads to less uncertainty, and that can then identify the long-term good value price. And we call this approach the research-oriented market access. So I'm just going to quickly run through. ROMA, as we call it, addresses a number of sources of uncertainty. There's the, what we call parameter uncertainty. What's the effectiveness of this treatment? Is an example, how safe it is. Then there's the assumptions. For example, what's the relationship between progression-free survival and overall survival? Often the health gain we're interested in takes too long to be observed, certainly with gene therapies, in a standard clinical trial. And we make assumptions about those relationships, but those are uncertainties, and real-world evidence can help us collect that data. And structural uncertainty. We don't know often what the impact on the clinical treatment pathway of a gene therapy will be, because it's so different, it's so radical. And so through real-world evidence, we can observe that and again reduce uncertainty and risk associated with the investment by the payer. So 3 phases of ROMA. The first is this feasibility. Can we do this type of real-world study to evaluate the uncertainty, the risk of the technology? Then, okay, let's identify the value of doing such a study. And let's design the study, what we call this monitoring design. So what are we going to monitor? What are we going to collect data on during the in-market use before we take the evidence back to the regulator and the payer? And then what are the decision rules that would inform a procurement contract? So I'm going to go through this a bit quickly. So we start off with a research protocol that builds on the HTA assessment that's already done for CADTH and similar organizations. It levers administrative data assets for data collection, synthesis, and reanalysis. We're trying to keep the costs as low as we can. We want to use the electronic medical records. We want to use the administrative data sets so that we don't have to do de novo data collection as we do with a clinical trial. We develop alternative research designs because we want to identify the lowest cost and most rapid one that reduces the uncertainty to the point where a decision maker can say, yes, I'm now confident I can agree to a long-term price for the technology. And then we use the real-world evidence to update the decision making. And we do all of this in 3 stages, and each stage has a continuation criteria, because we don't want to pursue something that's not going to get us to the target of more certain decision making for a long-term price proposition for these technologies. So in stage 1, we use this thing called expected net benefit. Simply, it's the value of the additional health that's produced by the new technology when you've taken away the cost of introducing that new technology. That's all it is. Then we use Bayesian approaches to updating the evidence base. So the recovery trial in the UK that's been doing all the COVID treatment comparisons, that's been using these Bayesian methods, and so it's coherent with that, but it's mathematical modeling that we're doing it with, and updating mathematical models. And then we produce a range of outputs about the value of the research. So these acronyms, the last one's the what matters, because it tells us the value of a certain sample size, additional information on a certain number of patients, which is what we're going to use to decide how many patients should be followed up in the conditional period for us to get to the point where we're confident to make a long-term decision. De novo model development, that's an engagement with all the stakeholders. I don't want to spend too much time on that because I know the clock's ticking. And we get out of this, oh, there we go. Continuation criteria. For at least one source of uncertainty, one parameter, the value of the information in terms of reducing uncertainty has to be greater than the cost of the study. Really obvious and sensible decision criteria. Then we move into step 2, and this is where we do the detailed design, and we're looking for the most efficient, the optimal research design, which maximizes what we call this net present value of sample information. And why we need to look over time is because the uptake of the technology, how quickly it diffuses, determines how quickly we'll get enough evidence. And so we have to model the diffusion, the uptake of the technology, to know when we will get enough data to actually make an updated decision. So we're designing with that diffusion rate in mind. It's very similar to when you're designing a clinical trial and you model how many patients you expect to recruit in any time period. Very similar to that, but we're doing it about patients in the real world for the technology of interest here. And again, we get to, we're trying to identify the most efficient design, and we have a continuation criteria, which is simply that there must be one design which says the value produced is more efficient, of the evidence produced is more than the cost of collecting that data. Reasonably obvious. And then we implement the study and collect the data of using the most research efficient design. So we have a research-oriented market access agreement. So it's a contract between the payers and the manufacturers that this data will be collected, and that at a predefined point in the future, the decision to fund will be reviewed and a new price will be identified to reflect what is known. And that could include that the technology is removed from the system if it doesn't produce the value. And we iteratively review the data at each readout period and apply the stopping condition. And we complete the analysis either when the stopping condition is met or when you've got to the end of the agreed contract period. And it's quite simple. The stopping condition is the value of additional information is less than the cost of collecting it. And this happens when the real world evidence either produces a consistent mean expected benefit but with reduced uncertainty. So this is the blue. The red is the estimate of what we expected to happen before the study, and the blue is when we incorporate the additional information. You might also find that the additional information tells you that this technology is not good value, and therefore you can stop with the technology and stop with the study. Or you may find the additional information tells you that it's even better value than you thought, and you can stop with the study. So on the left, I've shown I've taken a quote from a CADETH HGA report for type 2 semaglutide for type 2 diabetes, and their conclusions are reimbursement with conditions, but nothing specific about what those conditions were, saying the limitations existing with the approach the manufacturers took left a high degree of uncertainty. Cost effectiveness could not be established, and this was associated with significant limitations and lack of transparency. And finally said there's insufficient information available to justify a price greater than currently reimbursed second-line treatment. And this is the kind of thing you would expect to happen to most gene therapies if they were put through a traditional HGA. Whereas the research-oriented market access approach to HGA gives this generation of real-world evidence option to the decision maker, a very specific design. And traditionally, HGA agencies only have three options, and gene therapies would almost always end in the do not recommend, or recommend with very challenging conditions. ROMA is a fourth option, which is about on-market research and specifies the price for the technology during that research. And so it allows HGA agencies to achieve an optimal balance between price and uncertainty at the time they have to make a recommendation. It hopefully allows patients to have timely access to these novel therapies. And manufacturers are ensured fair compensation, both during the initial evidence development period and then the long-term market access period once the ROMA is completed. And payers are supported in their need to make efficient funding decisions. I think that's that. And this is the project team who do all the clever work at the IHE. I'm just the person who presents these things. So thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Chris. That was really fascinating. We do have a few questions from the audience, so maybe we'll start with those. So the first question concerns um, uh, discussions around public and private partnerships, so P3. So our assessments being conducted on how medium-sized, somewhat interventionalist economies such as Norway are handling this with its sovereign wealth fund. Would you be able to share any thoughts you have on that?
So Norway has a specific pathway for all their diseases and has identified a higher willingness to pay for those, and undoubtedly is benefiting from and using its sovereign wealth fund to cover the costs of that. I haven't seen any recent developments in the Norwegian approach, but they are treating high-cost drugs for rare diseases and including gene therapies as a special case within their HTA process.
Okay, thank you. Another question regards the fact that gene therapies can be modified and tweaked over a fairly short time frame to continuously improve these therapies, leading to a short lifespan for any particular product. So can you discuss how the Roma approach might apply in such a situation?
So what Roma allows you to do is to incorporate additional evidence. So if the tweaks, as I describe it, provide evidence of improved effectiveness, for example, so it addresses one of the uncertainties that's driving that's addressed by the Roma, then that can be incorporated into an update of the analysis and thereby identify a more rapid accumulation of data. So if there's external data that you can incorporate into the model and reevaluate the time that it will take to get to enough evidence to make a definitive decision, is one of the ways that could be incorporated. Of course, it could play the other way if it's actually if the change creates a new uncertainty, then that might actually lead to the need for a reevaluation and almost a restart of the Roma process if actually created an uncertainty in a different component of the evidence base. So, but if the tweak addresses an established uncertainty that's important, then that can be incorporated into the analyses. Yeah.
A somewhat related question is contemplates a therapy that's being rolled out in a trial, but after a while does not prove to be cost effective. So are there political issues that would arise from withdrawing public funding from a therapy that is currently available?
So I think one of the things that's exactly one of the core issues that we were trying to address for decision makers, where through setting up this system, the contract that brings the technology into the market is also the contract that takes it out of the market. And so there are issues around patient contracts as part of this. So in the same way that pharmaceutical companies contract with patients in trials so that they understand that their access to the therapy will cease at a certain point in time under certain different circumstances. Well, actually, this is a continuation of research that used to take place pre-market, but the uncertainty and the risk that these things are not good value remains, and therefore the consideration of how do we design patient contracts so that they understand that if certain conditions are not met, the access to the therapy will stop. So realistically, what would probably happen under those circumstances is people who are currently receiving the therapy will continue to get access, but new patients won't get access to it once it's not met that if it doesn't meet the targets that are specified in the procurement contract.
Okay, I think we have time for a couple more questions. So this is a question about some of the comments you made when drilling down into the equitable access that seem to focus on Health Canada approved indications, which rely heavily on sponsored decisions. So studies, the regulatory market access submissions. Do you see this as an issue? And if so, why or why not?
Can you say that again? I mean, I think is the question that do I see that the central role of the regulatory process as a condition for getting access to funding? Do I see that as problematic from an equity perspective?
I think that's what.
Okay. I think when you are this is assuming the funding is coming from some form of pooled public resource, whether you do that through a social insurance or private insurance or a public taxation funding. The money you spend on one therapy cannot be spent on another therapy. So if we require if we require a certain level of confidence that a therapy works before we spend public money on it, which seems reasonable to me, that we want taxpayer dollars or publicly pooled money to be spent carefully and responsibly, because it's money that can't be spent on something else that we value. If we accept that condition, which I do, then the regulatory process of Health Canada seems a pretty effective vehicle for ensuring that that's done consistently. So yes, any process, any system, at the margins there will be special cases who appear to be disadvantaged from it, and Health Canada have created and are continuing to create sort of bespoke pathways to try and limit those special cases. But the principle that a certain level of evidence of the effectiveness of the technology is required before we divert public dollars from current uses to that new activity, that new technology, I'm quite comfortable with that, I have to say.
Okay, maybe I'll just slip in one other quick question. We've talked about Canada, which is a developed country. What about emerging countries, developing nations? We talked briefly in CAR-T about potentially providing these. Well, how do you see the issues in that?
It's really interesting because the last 5 years have seen a really strong growth in the use of HTA amongst low and middle income countries, and so they're moving very fast. They're catching up in a hurry. So whilst they may not have the same digital infrastructures that we have, they're incredibly creative and innovative in how they make things work in their lower resource settings, and so I suspect they will be in principle looking at similar mechanisms to address technologies that are challenging financially for them, like these will be. So I think the gap between OECD countries and less low and middle income economies will reduce over the next decade in terms of how they use HCA for these decisions.